got barbecue back there, and you didn't invite me. Hurt my feelings.
Welcome into the channel. You're probably wondering, what is Destination Dynasty? And those of you that are familiar with the show from the podcast feed, I am bringing it to YouTube. It's not going to be in its full form, but these are going to be Destination Dynasty quick hits, where I talk about some stuff that I'm trying to do within my Dynasty portfolio, some things that worked for me, some things that didn't. But I try to keep these to 10 to 15 minutes per episode, and there will be still full Destination Dynasty podcasts that come out on the podcast feed. So if you're not already, like and subscribe to the new DD Fantasy Football channel on YouTube. Engage in the comments. We'll try to do back. And I wanted to highlight here 3 process trades in a league that went wrong for me. And I'll talk a little bit about the process, what the trades were, and why the end result was not exactly what I was aiming for. As you can see here, rocking the process versus players t-shirt. Shout out to Dynasty Trades in 5. But this is one of those leagues where I've talked about it a little bit on the podcast, but I went into the season with a team that I already had a pretty good squad. I had what I thought would be a playoff squad, and my goal was to try to have my cake and eat it too. Meaning I wanted to try to invest in a lot of future assets. As you can see on the screen, I have 6 2026 firsts, but the goal was not to punt for 2026. The goal was to acquire that future capital. 25 was too hard to get at that point because we had already rolled over into the 2024 offseason. But I figured, you know what, I'll go for 2026, but my goal was to still win the league. And I made some trades that I regret that probably cost me a shot at the championship. Sure, I have a bunch of picks in 2026, including 6 firsts, 2 seconds, 3 thirds. So I'm loaded going forward, and I have a pretty decent roster. But I made 3 trades that I wanted to talk about where it's not always process over players in terms of getting the best results. So a little history on this league. This is a super flex league. It is a 12 by 11. Start a quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 receivers, a tight end. There is a super flex, and there are 4 flexes. There's nothing crazy about the scoring other than it is 2 PPR for tight ends. So if you scroll on over to my roster right here, here we are. So it is a start 11. It is a lineup league. And actually, let me scroll down to show everybody the format. 12 by 11. There are the starting lineups. This is a very cool thing. I'm going to be using Dynasty-Daddy to go through this analysis of this league. As you can see here, if you go to the bottom, you will be able to see the lineups, the scoring, how many total roster spots there are. And then more importantly, if you highlight this position settings, how many players are rostered at each position. There is a taxi in this league as well, but you can see kind of where the roster construction is from a macro view across the league. For this instance, in this league, 73 quarterbacks are rostered. You can see that right here. So a lot of backup quarterbacks. Heck, some third string quarterbacks are rostered. Tight ends, it's also pretty high given that it's a 2 PPR. So you have 70 tight ends that rostered. And you can see the running backs and the wide receivers. So it's a pretty deep league in terms of how many players can be carried, given that the rosters are expanded for the offseason and there is a taxi squad. So let's go on up to my roster. You can see the draft picks. So if you haven't listened to the roster construction series, I do it based on a 12 by 11 lineup league with 1.75 tight end premium. So this is 2.0. Tight ends maybe have a little bit more weight in terms of flex viability. But looking at my roster construction, I have a lot of running backs, as you can see right here, carrying 13 running backs. Quarterbacks, plenty of backup quarterbacks. I have 10 quarterbacks on my roster. My only starters being Lamar Jackson, Trevor Lawrence. I was able to get by. I did exactly what I talked about in the roster construction series. If I don't have a second quarterback, which in this case, I did have Trevor Lawrence. He was as part of one of the trades that I made that I wanted to say I regret. But outside of T-Law, I had no need to upgrade from T-Law, because I had guys that started throughout the rest of the season. Jameis Winston, Drew Lock, DTR got some starts. Now, none of these other guys got starts, but the point was I had the ability to essentially just stream the second quarterback within my own roster because I had the roster construction that I had. Same with running backs. Pacheco, injured for a lot of the season. Kamara and Connor stayed healthy. Eckler, injured off and on. Tajay Spears wasn't useful till the end of the year. And then just a bunch of running backs on a 53. But I was able to survive with essentially a mishmash of running backs coming into the season. Heck, all 5 of them may have survived into the next season. Maybe I get something out of one of these guys down here. But the end goal is I had a lot of running backs and a lot of quarterbacks rostered. Now, receivers, I did add a couple of these players towards the end of the year, but for the most part on the season, I operated with these 6 receivers: Marvin Harrison, Garrett Wilson, Zay Flowers, Mike Evans, Devontae Adams, Stephon Diggs. Now, Stephon Diggs ended up getting injured, but in this format, given that it's 2 PPR, Kyle Pitts, Jonnu Smith, Evan Ingram, Dallas Goedert. So I essentially rotated between these 9, those 4 tight ends, and these 5 receivers. I basically just rotated those guys in my receiver spots and my flex spot. I talked about that on the roster construction series where I needed to start a tight end, 2 receivers, and 4 flexes. So I needed 7 of those guys every week. Now, there were some weeks where I could have started Austin Eckler or Tajay Spears. But for the most part, I essentially used the tight ends and the receivers as interchangeable, and I started those guys in the flexes, meaning if Kyle Pitts had a good game, I probably captured him. Jonnu Smith, I ended up picking him up midway through the season. Guess what? He was almost always in my lineup when he had a good game because I set my roster up to make sure that I was starting him even before it was obvious to start him every week. So the roster construction was good. And that's probably how you have to play a league when you've given up assets to acquire this much future draft capital. And I figured, you know what? I have Lamar Jackson. I can ride him. I have a guy like Evan Ingram in this format is great. These receivers, while none of them are studs, I had receivers that I could pretty consistently get some spike weeks out of, but also get a floor of production out of. And then the flexes were wild cards. You know, what did I get out of somebody like Kyle Pitts, Dallas Goedert? My running backs, they had to stay healthy, but Kamara and James Conner stayed healthy for most of the year. So it basically came down to what did I get from those flexes? And I'm fine with rolling with guys like Goddard, Kyle Pitts, even Jonnu Smith before, you knew you had to start him every week. I'll just live with what I'm getting in the flexes from those guys. So the roster was set up to perform the way that I intended. I didn't have too many decisions. I didn't have too much excess war or excess value just hanging around on my bench, but I also had a competitive roster. I was in first place for much of the season, got passed up towards the end of the season, and then got knocked out in the first round of the playoffs. And that's where we get into the 3 trades that I think probably cost me the championship. Because as you can see, I went 17-8. You sort by record, I ended up going 3rd best record. So I missed out on the bye by a game. And in the semifinals, you had to be one of the top 2 performers in week 15. So there's no head-to-head. It was just all play record from 3, 4, 5, and 6 in week 15. I didn't cut it. Didn't make it to the semifinals. Boom, I'm out in the first round. So let's look at the 3 trades. And these were trades where I essentially said, you know what? I have assets. My roster construction is already where I want it to be. And basically, I can tier down, pick up extra capital, and I'm shooting for mostly picking up extra usable running backs or extra future firsts. I don't really want thirds. Like, this was not the roster where I'm looking to nickel and dime. I had enough stuff to nickel and dime. I had all my future picks, and I also had my roster construction set up where the only reason I would want to nickel and dime would be later on if I'm trying to buy spot starts. That would be the one thing that I probably would have wanted to held on to a couple of those thirds, a couple of those seconds for. Nonetheless, I made 3 trades that I think ended up costing me in the long run. So let's go all the way down here to the beginning. The first trade we're talking about right here. So this trade was made where I traded away my Justin Herbert. Now, this was in the offseason where the narrative on the new Herbert offense with Jim Harbaugh was it's not going to be that high of volume. I'd much rather pivot off of him if I could still get the current dynasty value that he brought. And so I all of a sudden end up getting Trevor Lawrence, who I kind of looked at, okay, Trevor Lawrence versus Justin Herbert for a 1 to 2 year window. I can live with that. I threw in Trey Lance, but I got back a 2026 second in Tank Dell. And you may be going, okay, that's not a bad trade. Herbert was good for real life, but for a fantasy quarterback, it wasn't like he was an asset that I couldn't have moved off of. So if you go over here to these actual trades, as you can see, this trade, it was made on March 15th. I gave up Trevor. I gave up Justin Herbert and Trey Lance, got back Trevor Lawrence, Tank Dell, and a second. Now, why do I regret that trade? Well, first of all, this is the one of 3 trades that I probably regret the least. But ultimately, that going down the stretch where I had to end up starting either Drew Lock or Dorian Thompson-Robinson, which didn't happen in time for me to actually be able to use those guys or have something to use during the playoffs, probably cost me because Justin Herbert would have helped me. Justin Herbert potentially would have helped me get the bye. Justin Herbert potentially would have helped me get out of the semifinals. And then I actually did fairly well in the playoffs when it didn't really matter. Now, the one saving grace with that deal is I did end up trading Tank Dell and a 25 third for a 26 first. That was on October 4th. So that was after the Diggs injury. I traded Tank Dell and a third for a 26 first. So one of those firsts, I did end up trading from my excess because at the time I didn't need Tank Dell. I was able to flip him for a 26 first. So if there's a saving grace, I made another move essentially using the free piece that I got in the deal, the T-Law Tank Dell for Justin Herbert. I ended up getting a first out of that. Would I do that again if it was just T-Law to first for Justin Herbert, even if I knew what Justin Herbert was going to do? Yes. So I'm kind of partially regretting that trade. But again, what I probably should have done to rectify that one is, why didn't I move Trevor Lawrence when he was injured? What else could I have done? I got a little cocky and I figured, you know what? I can just roll with Drew Lock, Jameis Winston, DTR. I'll get a second starter, and I really don't need that great of a second starter because I have Lamar Jackson. It probably ended up costing me. The other two trades that I definitely regret, though. So let's scroll up and take a look at these two deals. So right here, this is the first one. This is the deal that really, really haunts me. June 23rd, 2024, I traded away Jamar Chase, and I got back Tajay Spears, Garrett Wilson, and a 26 first. Now, that's going to end up being the 111, and there's the deal right here. So at the time, I'm sitting here thinking, man, I'm really high on Garrett Wilson. I'm getting a 26 first. It was a team that had a low potential points, in my opinion, in terms of what the projection was going to be. Now, this team ended up making the finals, so it wasn't a good trade from the pick that I got back. And of course, if you go and look at the extra piece that I got in Tajay Spears, this is a cool thing about MFL, is I can look at Tajay Spears. How many times did I start him? This is where there's a little bit of a flaw. Now look at this. Tajay Spears. Didn't start him once. Right? So I did pick him up in that trade, getting a first and Spears and Garrett Wilson for Jamar Chase. I don't think a lot of people would have argued with that deal in the summer. Obviously, Jamar Chase goes on to be the biggest difference-making skill player in the league. Garrett Wilson was good, but not great. But the biggest key of that deal, forget about the 26 first that I got back, whether that's the 111, 105, whatever. The pick didn't end up mattering as much as the fact that one of the assets I got back was Tajay Spears, and I didn't use him. So I kind of added a piece that I didn't maximize. And not that Tajay Spears was great, but look at this. Week 15, fantasy semifinals, his best game of the year. Look at that. NS, not started. So the one time, if it would have made sense for me to use him, was his best game. Wasn't in my lineup. So now that trade, although it was decent process, the other piece that I got in the form of Tajay Spears, that at the time I would have gone, oh, hell yeah, I get a free Tajay Spears in this deal, right? Didn't matter because I didn't use him. My construction wasn't set up to be able to flex him, and I probably could have been more aggressive, maybe moving off of a guy like Kamara or James Conner. But once you get that train rolling, you don't actually want to make that deal. Thus, even though I got Spears back in the trade, he didn't help me in 2024, and now I'm subject to what is he worth as an asset? A third? 2/3? Like, there's not much I can do with him. Last deal that I definitely regret right here. So this was made right after that other deal in July 10th, 2024. I gave up Jaylen Warren. So you can look at the Jaylen Warren I gave up in this deal, kind of canceling out the Tajay Spears asset, right? So I got Spears in the previous deal, able to trade Jaylen Warren a couple weeks later because they were basically the same thing coming into the season. I also gave up Malik Nabers. So right here, Malik Nabers, Jaylen Warren, 2 seconds, which the seconds didn't end up really mattering. Late seconds, got back Marvin Harrison and a third. Now, was there that big of a difference between Marvin Harrison and Malik Nabers? Not really. Nabers was better, but I still started Marvin Harrison almost every single week. He was okay. But in the end, I paid a little bit of a tax that I probably could have fired those extra seconds had I not traded them for a couple other pieces. And maybe those could have bailed me out of a deal at the end of the year if I had a couple extra seconds in 2025 laying around, where I tack those onto T-Law and I get another quarterback. So definitely having a little conviction. And I think at the time I had too much Malik Nabers, not enough Marvin Harrison. So there was a little bit of a portfolio that went into that deal. But essentially the lesson learned on this trade was I tiered off before I really had any real information. At the time, it was all Marv's just set up to smash. Nabers, there's a little question mark about his quarterback situation. And even I put out some content saying the quality of his targets is going to be so low. It's going to be very, very hard for him to really make a difference. He didn't have him down as getting 170 targets or whatever he got. So if you could just project that, then it's going to be very hard for him to fail. Didn't see that coming. Traded the 2 seconds and Nabers for Marvin Harrison. Started Marvin Harrison all year. So I'm okay with trading for him and making sure he's in my lineup. It's not somebody that I'm going to bench if he's not performing. My construction was set up to essentially just ride out whatever I get from the rookie receiver. But obviously I have a worse asset here. I gave up the 2 seconds, and the 2 seconds with a thin roster like this, because as you can see, I only have a third remaining in 2025. So I'm going to have to now leverage the 26 picks, dip into those where essentially I got a little arrogant and I just figured, you know what? I've already tiered off of so many pieces. Maybe I'll get a little aggressive. I'll make the bet. I'll give up 2 seconds plus Nabers to get Marv. It didn't work out. And ultimately, this team that finished top 3 in everything, points for, potential points, record, didn't get the bye, missed it by a game, got knocked out in week 15. And that is an example where I got a little cute with at least 2 of the 3 trades, but they were all 3 process trades where I thought I was getting a little of the leverage and or better player back. And they probably all 3 in hindsight backfired. So hopefully you enjoyed this. This is just lesson learned. 3 trades that I regretted, all process trades in a league that ended up likely costing me the championship. If you like this kind of content, engage in the comments. Again, some Destination Dynasty pods, the typical 30 to 45 minute shows will still be happening on the podcast feed. But hopefully you enjoy this on this feed in terms of video content. Try to do some Destination Dynasty quick hits every once in a while, just talking about my leagues, talking about mistakes that I've made, talking about things that I'm trying to do. Like, subscribe to the channel, engage in the comments. I will hit you back if it's something interesting that maybe could turn into a future topic of discussion. We've also launched a new mock draft show, the DD Fantasy Rookie Mock Show, that will be happening once or twice a week. We will be doing a mock draft in a different type of format. So check those out if you haven't already. Like and subscribe to the channel and engage in the comments. And with that, I will sign off.